Hello, I'm Olly. I run Carve Broad Swords. It's my talk, Carve Broad Swords, ensuring multiple paths to growth. So when I started coming up with the talk, a lot of people didn't actually know what the word sword is, so I thought I'd just define it for you quickly. It is an expanse of short grass. If you don't know what an expanse of short grass is, it's one of those. That's a sword. It tends to be between buildings and other bits of land, like a beach in this instance here. So a little bit about me first, just so you know the provenance of where I come from and my expertise. I run Carve Broad Sword. I've been CEO. I pressed the wrong button there, sorry. So yes, I run Carve Broad Sword, CEO. I also run Gamebridge, a networking event. I've been in the industry for 18 years. 11 of those have been running Carve Broad Sword, and I've also done some teaching at university. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about our journey, and that's to give a bit of background about where this talk comes from, but also it'll help you to work out how I've got to the point I've got to. So we started off with Digital City. It's a startup grant that gave us some early funding to enable us to afford to start up in the first instance, to take that leap. They've closed down. They were in Middlesbrough, but they've shut down now. Middlesbrough Digital took over, but now they've shut down. So Alt Labs is the current thing that you should be looking at. So if you're in the Teesside area, I would look up Alt Labs. They're based out in the Flock building just down the road. So after we started off, we began doing consultancy. It was just two of us as the founders. We were doing consultancy in design, QA, and production, but as effectively worked for hire. Once we had that, we started to look for grants to try and fund our own IP, because we wanted to be an own IP studio. And then we got those. We got the UK Games Fund, fortunately, and we started prototyping our first game, and then used that prototype to try and land some publisher funding. We were fortunate enough to get that. But then throughout the journey, after the publisher funding, after the money was spent, we found that work for hire needed to get done. And so we did a bunch of work for hire in dribs and drabs here and there, as was necessary to bring in extra funding along the way. We then started a second own IP before the first own IP was finished. There are pros and cons to that, but I'm not going to talk about that in this talk. And then, of course, after that comes lack of profit. So we found ourselves in a position where we're still in a situation where we need to get cash. And it's made me reflect back on the business as a whole. So let's go back to this point here, the publisher funding and the own IP focus, and forget about everything past that for this moment. But what we've got here is a single sword, not swords multiple, and they're certainly not broad. So this is our game, The Siege in the Sandfox. It's 2D Metroidvania, pure stealth. And what we did is, once we got our publisher funding, we stopped doing the work for hire, and we put everything, all of our eggs, into one basket. And of course, what's dangerous about putting all of your eggs in one basket is that if you have all of your egg in one basket, well, what happens if the basket gets a hole in it? What happens if the basket runs out of money? What happens if the basket gets COVID? What happens if the eggs crack? Or if the egg needs to be ported to a new version of Unreal several times throughout the project duration? Or what happens if the egg has lots of problems in its development life cycle and some mistakes are made and certain tasks take significantly longer than anticipated? Well, if that happens, then the egg goes flying down and it crashes on your sword and it's blocked. Our sword is not broad enough. The egg's got in the way. So what do you do? So as I say, this is our journey, and we're at this point. So you can go back to your publisher and you can ask for more money. But of course, if you do that, your publisher is going to want to change the terms. When you start the negotiations, you're in a position of hopefully power, because you've got the value in the IP that you've built to that point when you start the negotiations. You're showing them a game. If they like the game and they want to sign it, already you've got you're proposing something to them that they want, and they have got what you want, which is their publishing services and often the cash. If you have to go back to them, you probably have to renegotiate those terms. Suddenly, the amount of percentage that you're giving away, the recoup percentage, other restrictions such as what platforms you're targeting, what marketing agreements are in place, and other things are going to change. Additionally, you're going to need more time. Not only are you going to need more time to get that money, to unlock those funds, but then negotiate those contracts, and then you run out of money most likely because you're out of time. You need more time. You could get another publisher. Of course, this is incredibly difficult to do in a situation where you've got one publisher already, because then you've got inter-publisher terms. If your first publisher, let's say for argument's sake, takes 70% recoup, then the second publisher might say, well, we want to take 70% recoup. We're not going to take 70% of the 30% that's left after the initial publisher. So there's lots of interplay problems with that potential. Additionally, the pie gets further away. If you are lucky enough to find a second publisher, well then first publisher takes a bite or slice of the pie, second publisher, and then what's left comes to you. Once again, hit recoup if you're lucky in most instances, and then revenue starts coming in, but then even then it's going to take a while for the first publisher, then second publisher, after the stores have taken their cut and their time. Money's going to be really far away at that point. You could raise funds. But the difficulty with raising funds is that it's difficult if you've got a publisher already. The money's going somewhere. It's not landing all to your company because the publisher's going to take their cut first. And if that own IP, that single IP, is your primary source of income for that business, well then it's going to be less appealing to someone that you're trying to raise funds from. So you can do work for hire. And if you start work for hire at this point, you're going to have to remove some of your team. Okay, all of your team, you're a single own IP studio, all of your team are working on that own IP. Suddenly, if they're having to do work for hire, well, you have to reduce your team down. And if you're having cash problems, you can't afford to be hiring people in the first instance. So suddenly, the own IP project slows down in the rate that it's moving forwards as well. Then you've got to find work for hire, which takes a long time. Then you've got to secure the work for hire. You're competing against other studios. There are a lot of studios that have work for hire as the primary form of their business. They've been doing it for years. How are you going to compete against them if you've been an own IP focused studio all this time? Then you've got to do the work for hire. Most instances you'll be working for at least a month before your first invoice. And then you've got to get paid for that. Often studios will have a 30-day, sometimes 60 days, sometimes more before they pay you. So you could be looking at a span of 2, 3, 4 months before you see a penny once you've started doing the work for hire or realizing that that's a route that you need to take. And then you need to make enough profit from the work for hire. So each member of staff that's doing work for hire needs to be able to pay for themselves and be generating enough profit to also be subsidizing the team that's still on the own IP. And that's going to cost more per head, or you're going to have to reduce salaries down, and they might say, well, if I'm doing work for hire, I joined you for own IP, I'm just going to bugger off and join another studio that is doing own IP. So what are you doing here, though? You're building a second sword, but you're starting late. So here's our sword. Here's our second sword. One of them is own IP, one of them is work for hire. We've got 2 swords. Fantastic. But they're still very thin. They're thin because you started late. You have no existing work for hire contracts because you've been own IP focused this entire time. So you've got to start from scratch, and that's going to take time. It's going to cost a huge biz dev burden. So if you've got someone at your studio who's a biz dev person who hasn't been working specifically on work for hire and has been doing something else, maybe they're a designer, maybe they're a producer, maybe they just run the business and keep the lights on, suddenly you've got a huge biz dev burden, and if someone has no experience doing that type of biz dev, might find it very difficult to learn in a short period of time. And it's going to take a huge amount of time. I mean, it's going to probably become their primary job role. Lastly, it might not end up being the solution anyway. You might not make enough money from it. You might not find the clients. You might put all the effort into finding this work for hire, and it ends up not answering the question. And then, of course, there's the cost to morale. As I said before, if your team have joined you to be developers for own IP and suddenly they're having to do some awful work for some other studio on something they don't like, they're feeling divorced from the team because they were in this sort of lovely production bubble working on your own IP, suddenly they're embedded at some other company working on a game they don't like. All of their friends that they work with are no longer talking to them because they're separate, slacks and all sorts. So hindsight, when you're at this point, it's too late. What you needed to be is have work for hire up here. This is what we should have done as well. because we had the consultancy, which is effectively work for hire, and that's when we should have gone, okay, work for hire continues then, we're raising money for grants, we've got the grants, sorry, we're trying to raise money with grants, we've got the grants, let's start own IP, okay, work for hire continues here, own IP starts here. So you need to broaden your swords, okay? You need to make work for hire fatter earlier, broader earlier, okay? If you had done that earlier on, you might not have had the financial issues in the first instance, because you would have built up profit, and that profit you could have put in the bank for paying staff. It could have been a contingency budget, so you wouldn't have needed to go back to the publisher in the first place. It would have proved potential solutions. You would have had existing contacts that you would have had all this time, so if suddenly you needed to increase your work for hire, you go back to them and say, hey, we did that work for you before, can we come back to you now? And the same applies to testimonials. You'll have the testimonials from the previous work, and then you can take those to prospective new clients who will turn around and say, hey, you did that work here, fantastic. That gives us faith that you have the ability to pull off work for hire on our projects. It's easier to scale up if you've got the previous work for hire people involved in that team. You can move people from one to the other, and you have the existing experience and the processes involved in doing that, and switching and moving. There are, of course, pitfalls to work for hire. I'm not going to pretend it's just a flick the switch, or we were doing it all along, everything's fine. It's not that easy. There is the big one. The big problem is the work for hire trap. And any work for hire studio out there that also makes their own IP will probably be nodding along to these, I expect. What happens if you're offered a bigger contract? If you're offered a bigger contract than the staff that you currently have, and it's your main option on the table, or it's a fantastic option, it's one of those, I can't say no to this, but then you're going to have to staff up. And if you staff up, well, you might find you need to accept the job. So you scale up to complete that job, and then you need to maintain those increased costs. Those staff are going to cost you a lot of money. If your overheads are going to increase, you have to buy hardware, software licenses, an office perhaps, and all those costs are going to escalate, and then they're going to maintain. But staff predominantly more than anything else. If the next project is then smaller, what do you do with those leftover staff? And you don't want to be robbing your own IP to pay Paul. So, sorry, I'm not sorry, sorry. What you might do in that instance is to look at your own IP budget, look at VGTR if you have it, I'll mention that more in a second, and go, well, that VGTR money, I can have that in my work for hire section. Or nick the staff from your own IP, which is the main one people do. They'll take their staff from their own IP project. It's our project, we can do it in our own pace. We've got them, we know what their expertise are. There's no turnaround on the hiring process. I know that they can do this job for this client. Okay, so you pull that staff member from the own IP project and you stick them on the work for hire, and then you've got the same work for hire problems. You can also lose focus because you're taking away from the own IP, or because you've got multiple things going on at your studio. Some people that are working on own IP in this room might see the people doing work for hire in that room, or worse, vice versa. They might go, why am I having to do this contract work that I dislike when that person over there in the other room's making the really cool game that you guys are making? Yeah, I've covered that. And it's a lot of work to be broadening that sword. It's going to take you a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it's a constant drain on that biz dev person. So, in broadening the broadened, okay, when you decide to do work for hire, most people will look at work for hire as a games company and think, I'm a games company doing work for hire, I'm going to look for games companies that want work for hire. It makes sense. But there's a huge amount of transferable skills in the games industry, in games development, that you can take over to things like technology, general software development. It doesn't have to be games. I know someone that went from making games to programming traffic lights and tripled his salary. You can work in TV, film and media. But there are other avenues for those skills as well that some people just don't think to look for. And it is a case of looking for it. You can find or create the work by offering opportunities to people that don't know that they want them. So for example, well, not the best example here, but STEM education in general often has huge amounts of desire for technological progress and tools that increase opportunities for teaching. And there's a huge amount of grants out there, or there's very frequently grants out there that specifically focus STEM subjects. There are corporate clients that have very fat pockets that often want something clever or unique for their marketing department. And often they've got no idea how much something costs. So you can go to them, or they'll come to you or whatever, and you say, hey, we could do this with VR, or we do that with whatever. And they'll say, oh, we're really sorry, we've only got a budget of $250,000 for this 50 grand project that will take you a month. Because they don't know how quickly you can produce what you're saying in Unity or Unreal. And often they just have no idea how much it costs to create what you're creating. So they'll sometimes have silly budgets. I mean, sometimes it can be the opposite. We once had a client want a 3-month project for 10 grand. So, you know, we had to let them down quite hard to say that that's not going to get you anywhere. Environmental concerns right now are massive. They're on the top of a lot of people's thought processes. And when they're looking at environment offsets, they're looking at any clever method that they can do to not only do it themselves through, you know, the planting of trees and carbon offsetting, but also ways that they can show it off more than anything else. They want to show off what they're doing. And this can be visualizations, interactive activities on their websites, all these sorts of things. So it's very simple uses of your game-making technology and skills can be used to approach these guys and say, look, we can visualize your carbon offsetting and stick it on your website. And they'll go, oh, wow, yeah, brilliant. And then cross-media. So there's lots of opportunities for cross-media between games and film and TV and other things, but often people just don't know how to do it, because games, to those not involved in games, can often be seen as sort of a bit alien, a bit confusing. So the point here is that work for hire and finding it, broadening those work for hire opportunities, if you stick just into the games industry, you might find it quite quickly becomes closed or depressing, or there aren't as many options as you thought there were. So you can broaden that sword. Oh, and sorry, yeah, one more. Art museums and entertainment. A lot of these places are starting to lose their customers to the growth of the internet experience. So they need to get digital and find ways to keep themselves running by monetizing their experiences with the art assets, the museum assets that they have. So if you can use those skills to create some sort of interactive medium that doesn't even need to be consumed on the premises, then that's another opportunity. So approach these sorts of organizations. So hopefully at this point, you've got all these swords sticking out of your work for hire. Okay, they don't even need to be that broad, as long as you've got lots of them. But broadening your own IP comes next. So you can claim video games tax relief, or what is now called VGEC, which stands for Video Games Expenditure Credits. Thank you. And the amount of money that you get back from VGEC or VGTR can be, you know, can be big depending on your outgoing costs. My recommendation is with this is to earmark a certain amount that's absolutely for spending on a new IP. Okay, you've got your own IP that's being funded, it's got a publisher, stick some money to one side, if you can, for the new IP. And use it to hopefully keep that motivation of own IP going. Build technology if you can. If you're building a tool, so if you're programming a certain feature into your first game, such as, say, driving a car, don't just program driving a car into the first game. Program a tool that helps with your car driving. Car driving is a bad example, but you get the idea. And use that tool for the next game. So save yourself doing the same work twice. If you can, you look at that tool, look at the features it's currently got or the features it could have with a little bit more work, and then base your next own IP around that, then you know you can save a huge amount of time on the next project because you're just reusing the same work that you've already done. And we've done that with our second own IP. Believe it or not, our 3D open world driving sim uses some of the same tools that our 2D stealth Metroidvania uses. Of course, apply for grants and do this as early as you can, because a lot of them are time-based, but some of them will let you just hold on to the cash for a bit, and you can wait until you've got that cash, build it all up, and then go bam and start pushing the prototype. You can approach existing partners. If you've got a current publisher, there's nothing stopping you going back to them and saying, hey, by the way, we've got this new idea, would you be interested if we got the prototype to a certain point and put that in front of you, is that something that you might fund? And if they say yes, then you've already got an in, and then you can ask them, okay, what specific elements of that would you like to see? Would you like free-to-play elements? Would you like it to be online multiplayer? Would you know, if it was this or wasn't that, would that make you more or less likely to fund it? And so you can use your existing partners to inform the design of your next own IP project. Try not to cross the swords if you can. As I said, going back to the work for hire thing, you can cause problems. And try and save some cash. If work for hire winds down on one contract and you've got a member of staff or 2 or 3 or 10 or whatever that haven't got something immediately lined up, while you're trying to find work for them, stick them on the prototyping of the next own IP, or maybe even wait until that happens before you start. So you've carved broad swords. Your work for hire is broad, your own IP sword is broad. Your first own IP project is going along, an egg lands on it because it's fallen out of your basket, but you've got multiple eggs in your basket. So you take another route with your own IP. You go to work, or you move them into work for hire because your work for hire is broad enough to maintain them, and then you've got your existing work for hire that's carrying along, and then your journey goes from that to suddenly having swords all over the damn place. Loads of swords. There's too many swords. And then your swords will hopefully get broader.